Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Carolyn Kissane. I'm the Academic Director of the Center for Global Affairs at NYU. And before we get started on what I know is going to be a fantastic conversation, because we have three outstanding panelists joining us today, just want to take a few minutes to give you a little bit of background on the NYU Center for Global Affairs. So we have two graduate programs. We have the Masters of Science in Global Affairs, and we also have a new program, the Masters of Science in Global Security, Conflict, and Cybercrime. And we are hosting virtual information sessions about both programs. So if you have any questions, please do feel free to reach out. We'll connect you with the dates for our next sessions, and happy to answer any questions you have. We also have an amazing array of public events. And since last March, we have moved all of our public events to online Zoom, such as today. And like today, we're doing career events. We're also doing a number of events that are related to the program, or 8 concentrations and 3 specializations. And we also have a robust non-degree program where we offer career pathway courses, as well as certificates and other special programs. So again, anything that you'd like to learn more about regarding the CGA, just feel free to reach out. Now, what I am waiting for is today's conversation. And I cannot say it enough, but I'm so delighted to have these 3 outstanding CGA alumni with us, but also stellar professionals in their fields. We have Aziza Taylor, who is a graduate of the class of 2019, and she's the Communications and Marketing Manager of the American Medical Association. Rosalie Franson, who's a graduate from 2016, and she's a senior evaluator researcher with the Mark USA Incorporated. And Stephanie McCoy, who also graduated in 2019, and she is the executive director of the Peace Project. And they are going to tell us a lot more about their work. And again, today's conversation is about, talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And I want to highlight these 3 particular women for the work that they are doing, and for the conversations that they are also helping the CGA to have. This is, much of what we'll talk about today in terms of navigating difficult conversations, in terms of, how to build partnerships, allyship, just thinking about different tools and the knowledge, the skills that we really need to see more of. And, Aziza, Stephanie, and Rosalie have been part of the conversations that we're having at the CGA. And when we hosted a town hall a couple of months ago on diversity and inclusion and racism and global affairs, we were really fortunate to have their input and to have their expertise that we've been able to integrate. And grateful to the Office of Global Inclusion, Diversity and Strategic Innovation at NYU, who's also really helping NYU move these important issues forward. So they're not add-ons, but very much part and parcel of everything that we do. And for anything that you want to learn more about the CGA, this is just a little bit more, and I'll share this also as well at the end of our session. All right, but it's now time to jump in. And also, just we really want to make this interactive. So if anyone in the audience has questions, please feel free to use the chat function. We'll also save time at the end to answer any questions. So, the issue of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, it's very much at the forefront of many people's minds. I'd love for each of you to tell us a little bit more about the work that you do, a little bit about your career trajectory, and also sort of how DEIB issues are, part of what you currently do. Do we want to start, Aziza, and then we'll go to Stephanie and Rosalie? I'm kind of following along with my Zoom boxes here.
Okay, thank you so much, Carolyn, for that awesome introduction. As you mentioned, I'm class of 2019. So my concentration at CGA was actually in human rights and international law. I currently work as a communications and marketing manager for the Center for Health Equity within the American Medical Association. The center is literally like just a little over a year and a half old. So we're coming up on 2 years, but actually in the working aspect of it, we're really just a year into that work. Where the focus basically for the center, is to strengthen and amplify and sustain the American Medical Association's work to eliminate health inequities. And so that speaks to improving health outcomes and closing disparity gaps, which we know are rooted, in the historical and contemporary oppressive systems of power and structural injustices, and such as racism and exclusion and discrimination. One of our big charges, is to name racism as a fundamental cause of why inequities exist. So we are doing that through setting up a series of actions that work at the center of health justice to basically, change cultural norms, research, like going in depth with that, medical curriculum, policies, and practice. The focus for my role specifically and how we, work to do that is, aimed at changing the narrative around health equity nationally for the center, and then looking at providing relevant tools, to impact and empower folks to take that message forward and feel comfortable and, that they can do it within themselves. Another side of that is also making sure that we put in some best practices and expand the visibility and dialogue around the center and what we're doing there, so that we can really achieve sustainable engagement and spark actual change. So we're situating ourselves in that way, and I'm there to amplify all of those efforts. And then another part of my career, because I've had a varied, kind of career in communications, production, journalism. I've worked previously as a news producer, documentary filmmaker, and researcher, more along the historical types of documentaries, environmental justice focused documentaries, as well as working in city government in a way with the New York City Department of Finance as their press officer for the whole agency and the director of social media there. Another part of it for me is in my work scope is making sure that I provide opportunities and knowledge share with young people because I feel like they really are the future and they really have a lot of the wisdom and the knowledge needed, as we can see over these past couple of months, to really move change and shift culture forward. So I've been able to work and create workshops in documentary filmmaking with the partnerships with the YMCA of the Greater New York, and teaching young youth leaders in Haiti about the element of documentary filmmaking and using it as a tool of social justice, as a tool to preserve heritage and history, and as a tool to give them a platform, right, for their voices to be heard because they're brilliant, young folks. So hopefully that sums it all up.
Well, I think it just sort of touches the surface, right? But thank you so much. I mean, you've had, your trajectory and what you're currently doing and what you will do. So thank you so much for sharing. We'll definitely come back to dive a little bit deeper into some of those areas. Stephanie?
Yes, thank you, Carolyn, for the introduction. Thanks, Aziza, for explaining your work. I'd love to see us in our own work and seeing us, reduce the norms and social norms of what it means to have racism in the workplace and in everything that we do. As Carolyn mentioned, I'm the executive director of the Peace Project, Inc. We are a New York City and Los Angeles-based nonprofit that focuses on comprehensive human rights and global citizenship education program to middle school and high school students. We partner with local schools and communities to introduce our curriculum that focuses on the UN Sustainable Development Goals with the emphasis on poverty, equality, and environmental sustainability. We look at international human rights, children's rights and child labor, women's rights and gender components. And most recently, since the uprising of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, we have developed a race literacy curriculum. I developed that, and I really It's one of my passion projects. I was raised out here in South Los Angeles, and I experienced the public education system firsthand. And I know it wasn't inclusive or comprehensive at all. And I thought, now that we have this platform with the Peace Project, what better way to introduce race in a very informative, encouraging way to students of race literacy. And so far it's been going really great. We end the curriculum with activism just to show students that through everything we learn, even as students, you now have a voice, you have a social platform through social media and different means of communication. You can raise your voice and create social change just where you are. The Peace Project mission, we believe that our primary audience is middle school and high school students, as I mentioned. They're receptive to our message. At this point in their education, students ages from 11 to 17 are beginning to formulate realistic expectations for their lives and their career. They are capable of absorbing and reiterating their own words, difficult and abstract concepts. Throughout our presentations, we linked abstract concepts to pragmatic and relatable methods of peace and activism for students to pursue in their own lives. We want our students to really understand that their dreams are achieving peaceful, sustainable change that can spread from local communities all the way to a global level. The Peace Project facilitates 6 in-class sessions connecting their existing curriculum on the civil rights movement to conversations about contemporary human rights. We have weekly sessions that range from 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the program with the schools. Since the uprising, as I mentioned, of Breonna Taylor, I have made an effort to focus our partnerships in low-income and Title I schools. For those who are unfamiliar with Title I schools, those are more in the underrepresented areas in lower-income communities. So where I am in South Los Angeles, I focus on building our partnerships there so we can increase awareness in more of the areas that don't have that much inclusive education. Through games, activities, case studies, and dialogue, presentations, and projects, we focus our efforts on local institutions. Students directly interact with materials, issues, and leaders working on peace and community building solutions. We believe that our students have the right to be informed about current events and human rights violations so that they are better equipped to be empathetic, solutions-oriented, and engaged participants to become thought leaders. Thank you.
Wow, fantastic. I have so many questions for you about the work that you're doing in schools and how important it is and how you're giving voice to young people and empowering them to be change agents, which they are. And also, Stephanie did not add, but I will add for her, is that she also served in the U.S. Peace Corps, and she was a recipient of the Coverdale Fellowship at NYU. So your service goes way back. So thank you, Rosalie. Over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Carolyn, for the introduction. And I'm very honored to be here with 2 amazing co-panelists whose work I've gotten to learn a little bit about, but I'm very excited to learn more about in this conversation. So I graduated from CGA in almost 5 years ago, which is a lot to process because it feels like it was yesterday. But I currently work as a senior evaluator and researcher with the MARC, and we are a research and evaluation consulting firm. So what we do is we provide monitoring and evaluation, research services for a number of academic, nonprofit, international development clients. And I just started there in September. And I guess my relationship to DEIB there is that we have a growing number of projects or projects with a DEIB component, and it's a particular passion of mine. So I try usually to get involved with those projects. So just to give an example of what we're doing is we work a lot with academic institutions on STEM programs. So they're increasingly interested in evaluating whether BIPOC students feel a sense of belonging in STEM programs. What are some of the barriers and challenges they face? Do they feel supported? What is missing? So we help them kind of understand that better and come up with strategies to better support those students. We also do work with government agencies. So one of my projects, a government agency in California is opening an Office of Equity. So they ask us to carry out a baseline assessment, looking at sort of the existing level of racial and social equity awareness, develop a framework for it, and then develop a training strategy for their staff. We also do a lot of work with rural and tribal communities in Michigan, in North Dakota. So we have some projects with them around, one is around sustainable energy use. We do workforce development projects with tribal colleges. So our role there is kind of to evaluate the extent to which those projects outreach are responsive to community needs, again, are tribal, indigenous students feeling supported. So yeah, I'm not a DEIB expert necessarily, but I'm very excited to speak about it from kind of the evaluation perspective and what some of the conversations around DEIB are in evaluation, because there are lots going on right now.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I think also, I mean, Rosalie, thanks for highlighting that. You know, the three of you clearly, like, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging are very much part of a lot of the work that you're doing. And yet you're not, like, you're not head of diversity and inclusion within your organizations, your companies, but yet you're doing so much of the work. And that's what I'm really curious to sort of delve into more. Maybe we'll just kind of switch it. I mean, 2020 has been, now we're 2021. 2020 was such an extraordinary year for disruption, right? Disruption because of, being in the midst that we continue to be in a global pandemic due to COVID. Black Lives Matter, political turmoil, so much, right, has been sort of upended. Much of it, some of it for good, right, in terms of having this conversation and the work that's happening right now. But would love to sort of talk to each of you about, how the impacts of 2020 on your work. And, again, since we're talking about, diversity and inclusion, how have you seen shifts? So I'm going to start with you, Stephanie, because you talked about developing, a race literacy curriculum, and, the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many more in 2020, right? How you have these conversations with young people, like how do you integrate it into curriculum, bring it into schools that, many public schools right around the country, they have these mandated curriculums that don't allow a lot of space for integrating, topics and issues that really matter in that moment. So I'd love to sort of hear more about your work in that area.
Yeah, definitely. I wanted to just back up a little bit to kind of stem where the influence brought what came through about developing this race literary curriculum, and also with the Peace Project. So back in 2020, I was working on a statewide California ballot measure for education, Proposition 15. And it focused on education. It didn't specifically look at low-income communities, but I tried to make the lens to try to be more inclusive with that. I remember when the uprising happened, I thought, what is the best way to get these seeds planted of education? What is the best way to ensure that people see that race is really just a construct? This is very societal, poison in a sense. And I reached out to the founder because when I first started with the Peace Project, I was a fellow. I was a fellow throughout my Coverdell fellowship with NYU. And once I finished NYU, I was still working in the background, but I wasn't doing too much hands-on with the Peace Project. I reached out to the founder once I was seeing the protests and the riots happening. I was in the streets marching every day. I reached out to Ima, who's the founder, and I said, hey, how can we bring the Peace Project to LA? Because I think this is a real need right now. And I think institutions are hungry for this. So we talked about it. And I started branching out here. I started reaching out to schools here. But I realized that schools and public schools in California, the public school system here, they didn't want to do the heavy lifting of creating an entire curriculum themselves with that huge liability, because they have to go through so many different channels in public schools to get that approved. And I thought, how can we just be the middleman as a nonprofit who is kind of just, a non-threat in a sense? Reach out to the schools. They seem to be receptive to it. And also in New York schools as well, very much charter schools and private schools develop the curriculum. So the curriculum in race looks at breaking down the construct of it, breaking down slavery, breaking down the institution of slavery, breaking down the induction of slavery, and then kind of myriad it through the trend, like transcending it through how we got to where we are now. And the kids understand it. When we introduce race, they're already in their civil rights era in school. And so since they already know the freedom riders and kind of that whole historical civil rights era. And so when I come in, they have the foundation already, but I kind of break it down more of like, this is how it was socially constructed. Me and you, we're very same people. We have the same blood. However, through societal norms and through traditions that founded America, we are now in two different places. And this is how we can bridge the gap. These are the ways we can plant seeds. This is the way we can plant encouragement. This is how we can work together. And I feel like at an age that there are 11 through 13, they're very smart. And these kids are really, really bright, and they have the understanding capabilities to digest this information and to spit it back out to you in a form, in a project, in a sense. But I really see that they take to it. The teachers, sometimes you can tell the look on their faces when I talk about slavery, because I go more in depth with it. It's more of a personal project for me. And for them, it's a curriculum that they have to get through. And I'm like, no, if I'm gonna have this time, an hour and a half to talk about this, we need to really dissect it in a way where people can understand it at a rudimentary level, even if you're a teacher, principal, or a student. So I'm really proud of the work that we're doing with race literacy. We tie it into gender, to sex, and a lot of things about, trans and homophobia that have been happening. And even myself as a Black queer woman, I show up in my body every day as a Black queer woman. So even if they don't have an understanding what a Black queer woman is, I'm sure I make sure that I introduce it to them in a very encouraging way. And I know there's some teaching styles where students can sometimes feel forced that they have to understand this. Through my education, how I teach it, it's more of a seed planter and a thought, and the teachers and the parents do the rest. I just plant the seeds. My job is not to make sure that they understand this completely. It's just, these are some ideas to look at as we're learning education in a very informal way.
Wow, thank you. So great. It's really fantastic. Rosalie, since Stephanie was talking about school curriculum and you talked about your work with Native American communities and also STEM and how you're seeing, right, how you're sort of building in diversity and inclusion issues into evaluation, we'd love to sort of hear about how sort of 2020 has impacted your work.
Yeah, so I think one thing is definitely a growing demand from clients to have the tools and have the support to better understand these issues. But I think even within the evaluation community among evaluators, it's opened up a lot of new conversations. And these were conversations that were certainly being had, but maybe more at the margins. And now I went to this year's American Evaluation Association conference, like all sessions are on diversity, equity, inclusion, power dynamics, evaluating activism. So there's really been this push beyond thinking just about diversity and evaluating a program by saying, is it recruiting diverse participants? But going beyond that and saying, how can evaluation be used as a tool for social change and for equity? How can evaluation be used to challenge white supremacy? Can it be used to challenge white supremacy? And then more broadly, that's opened up a conversation about how is power distributed in philanthropy and in development? Is it possible to do good and to challenge supremacy in a system that is inherently inequitable and imbalanced because the system consists of wealthy funders and recipients of the money. So the way that the money is structured and distributed is inequitable. So what does that mean for our work and how can we challenge some of those dominant norms and processes? So I'm hearing a lot about participatory methods of evaluation, making sure that you give evaluation results back to the community, kind of closing that feedback loop and not just coming into a community, extracting information and leaving, but actually presenting it to them, making it so that they can use it as an advocacy tool if they so desire or to push for policy change, ensuring evaluation is responsive to community needs. So what questions does a community have themselves that they want answered and not just to donor and funder needs as it often is, or used as like a performance monitoring tool as it often has been in the past. And also thinking about developing an evaluation framework based on equity from the start. So even simple things like making sure that instruments are available in different languages, making sure that they're accessible to everyone, making sure that the method of evaluation matches the community. So not, having a survey or conducting a survey in a place where filling out a survey doesn't make sense culturally. And also some interesting discussions about how can grant recipients or grantees evaluate funders? So turning it around on funders and demanding accountability from funders around proposal application processes, the extent to which they're accessible to grantees. So yeah, some really interesting discussions, but definitely a lot more work to be done to challenge some of those power structures.
Just maybe a quick follow-up. So are you seeing, because you identified that power dynamic, and we're going to be talking about power in a few minutes, but have you seen that funders are kind of responding accordingly in terms of really sort of building more DEIB issues, or really threading it in, and so that's to kind of to bring more balance to that relationship, to what has historically been, right? The funder kind of decides what is going to the project and how things are going to get funded, and ultimately also oftentimes pays for the evaluation.
Mm-hmm. I think it really depends according to the funder and kind of how they are structured internally and what accountability mechanisms they have internally. I will say I was on a call with a foundation a couple weeks ago, and their message was basically like, well, we'll do these things as long as, it doesn't slow us down, as long as it doesn't take up too much of our time, because this is just the way we've always done it, and it's inherently imbalanced, and there's not much we can do about it, and we can make it a little bit nicer, but that's all we can do. So that was very frank and honest, which I guess I appreciated, but it's also a bit, depressing that they are essentially saying this is the status quo and we're going to stick to the status quo, and we'll make like a nice PR show of us reaching out, but that's how it's going to be. But then there are funders who have really taken it on board and have done kind of an internal analysis of how power is distributed within their organization, and are really putting kind of their money where their mouth is. So it depends. I'm thinking of the Ford Foundation, for example, has done some really good work actually like funding community groups, activists long-term, like multi-year funding. So yeah, I'm not an expert on philanthropy, but those are just some things I've noticed. And usually when they do put the money there, then there are also interesting, innovative mechanisms of evaluating whether it's working that are led more by the grantees, rather than by the funder. So hopefully that positive trend continues.
Great, thank you. Aziza, you in your introduction, we, like, when we think of 2020, right? COVID first and foremost, and I for many, I hope everyone that's sort of on, joining us today recognizes the extraordinarily horrific health disparities, right? In terms of when you look at sort of COVID and it was very in terms of the inequitable impacts of COVID. Can you just talk to us a little bit about, in terms of in your position, what you have seen sort of change, or what you have seen to have sort of new demands, or where you're seeing sort of new directions? Or again, kind of taking us back to, diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, for sure. So we, for us, we just know and understand that, health feeds into every part of this, every part of the work, that all of us are doing, because if we're not able to physically show up in these spaces, then, nothing is really advancing or progressing. So one of the things that, with the public murder of George Floyd at the hands of police brutality, it further confirmed, for us, the pervasive threat, that to public health that racism is, and how that feeds into every facet of all of this. And that when we think about the pandemic, for historically marginalized and minoritized communities, we're actually kind of looking at 3 pandemics that we're dealing with at one time. So there's the actual COVID-19, there are the economic consequences of that health crisis and the impact that that's having on these, communities. And then the third is just the ongoing consequences that we have continued to experience through the systemic, racism and oppressive natures and white supremacy rooted within the United States of America and the fiber, of this country. So we understood that with everything taking place, it just exacerbated those ongoing inequities, and issues that we knew to be existing in those communities. So for us, it was naming those things and identifying those things. So, looking at and speaking to like the centuries-long structural inequities and injustices experienced by the most marginalized. So looking at that when it comes to, how the pandemic is impacting people of color, indigenous people, LGBTQ people, those who are women, those who are undocumented, and understanding that who is also at the crux of this, like who is also both caring and both experiencing this on disparaging levels. It's the same groups, right? So our essential workers, our frontline workers, majority of those are people from marginalized and minoritized communities. And then on the other end, majority of those cases, of deaths and, numbers when it comes to the cases are being experienced by those same groups of people, so the strain that is put on both ends is something that we're like, all right, we have to, find some sort of way to look at this, as a whole and understand the root, the root causes of it, but also understand, how racism is really impacting people's health and the outcomes of health. And for us, understanding that 80% of health happens outside of the hospital. It's about 20% that happens within, right? So where we like to say is where you live, work, eat, and pray is what really is impacting your health. So by the time you go into the hospital, it's necessary for those people within those communities to also understand, like, this is all connected. So some of the things that came out of this, for the AMA as a whole, they denounced police brutality, and connected that, to it being a public health threat, and racism being connected to that as well. And we tend to continue to talk about highlighting the chronic effects of experiencing racism as people, because it does affect your mental state, it does affect your physical body. Studies have shown of the increased amount of cortisol levels that happen at the experience of dealing with these types of things, and how that also then lends itself to high cholesterol, heart health, impacting heart health and things of that nature. So historically, in November of 2020, one of the really powerful things that came out of it was that the American Medical Association actually adopted 4 new policies. And one of those is recognizing racism as a public health threat. The second was that race is a social, not a biological construct. So dismantling that idea of race-based medicine, and everything that's put into that particular practice. The other portion of that was eliminating the practice of using race as a proxy for biology and genetics, and police brutality as a manifestation of structural racism. And so through the work that we've done, through partnerships with the local communities, that's one aspect of it, and also calling for more research, more inclusive research to be done when it comes to those particular communities who have been marginalized and minoritized. So pushing that to the forefront and finding ways to implement equity into the policies around health that are being developed. So we're consistently, working across those different facets, and also within the medical educational curriculum, and making sure that it's a part of that too, like the curriculum and the conversations that are being had. So for us too, one of the things that I'm really inspired by is a lot of the movement is coming from our young medical students. So they're out there pushing, for change, impacting policies, and, these different policies that I just mentioned were actually a force from rooted in many of their advocacy, their spaces of advocacy, and them talking about it and bringing it forth to the House of Delegates, and speaking their truth. So it's been really amazing to see.
So much. Thank you. So there's just, yeah, I have like 100 questions for each of you after your responses. Can we just talk about, power has come up, right? The subject of power, but how, and just for the three of you, whoever wants to answer it, in terms of how have you navigated, difficult conversations? Like how have you navigated getting, how do you think about partnership and allyship? And how do you build it if it's not there, or where it's missing? So I'd love to kind of hear from all of you, one of you, about sort of that, you know, how you approach those difficult conversations, maybe what you've learned, maybe from a specific example of a difficult conversation that you've had. Who'd like to jump in?
I definitely go. It's an interesting question. I was reflecting on this question for a bit. I think in most of my professional settings, I've been one of 3 Black people in the organization or in the company. And so when you walk into a presence in a room where you don't see yourself represented, it's already somewhat of a challenge. And so you're, in my mind, I'm always unconsciously having dialogues in my head about how I'm going to have to navigate myself through the duration of my employment with whoever I'm with. But in all the places I've worked, I found myself in comfortable conversations. I find myself with very microaggressive leaders. And there's this huge misconception I found in my own experiences in the workplace that undermine a Black person's ability to have valuable input or have a valuable work ethic. And I think obviously that comes from a lot of stereotypes and a lot of misconceptions of just Black people in general. But I found myself being devalued a lot of times in the work. So to combat that, I had to really develop a lot of tough skin. I had to come to myself and realize that if I don't stand up for myself, if I don't advocate for myself, who will? Especially if I'm in an organization that I'm underrepresented. So how do I bring awareness to this? First, I always like to see if other Black people or minorities in the organization feel the same way I do. And so I'll have some side conversations to see, let's gauge how we feel, how's the work environment, and what do we all feel when we come to work. And through those conversations, I've had a unanimous consensus that everyone's felt the same. Okay, great. Now that we have a little bit more power, let's now talk to senior leadership. And I usually construct an email. So I myself will construct an email, I have them input, and we all sign it. And at the end of the email, we'll say we need to have a meeting to discuss some of the things that we feel are inequitable. We usually have a meeting. The senior staff has been receptive to it because they realize it's not just one person, it's 3 to 4, and mainly all of their minorities. That's a huge problem. So once they see that it's all of us coming forward and having conversation, they do take some actions to reduce it. They want to hear our demands, and some of our demands that our immediate supervisors don't believe in us. And that's really what it just comes down to. There's no belief in the work that we can do, and there's no belief in the valuable input that we have. So usually those supervisors have been relocated, or we have been relocated, but into a place that we feel is more supportive of what we're doing. Secondly, we do demand diversity training, and we don't advocate that we would do it. And that's the thing, I think, in some of these situations, is that when we think about diversity inclusion work, we automatically think to the minorities to do the work itself. But sometimes that is an extra barrier, that is an extra load to carry when we are the ones who's experiencing the same thing, and now we have to teach and reduce what has already been traditionally taught. And so we ask diversity and inclusion to be trained, and we also ask that it be monitored and evaluated. And so after a period of time, we want to know that, how are you guys keeping track and the retention of your employees, for one, and how are you keeping track to see if some of these issues have been mitigated? And so we don't want just a Band-Aid solution, we want to see our demands met. And usually I've seen it happen pretty swiftly. So I would recommend getting a consensus to see who all feels the same way, writing an email to senior leadership, and then taking measurable action steps to see if the workplace environment has changed. And if not, there are other employment opportunities that you can seek.
Great, thank you. Rosalie, Aziza, anything you'd like to add?
I guess for me, thinking about partnership and allyship, the number one thing that I would recommend doing if you are interested in being an ally or in forming a partnership is just challenging your own positionality and challenging your own assumptions from the start, and trying to apply that to your work. So in evaluation, for example, thinking really critically about some of those assumptions you have, even things like, what does positive change look like? What does success look like in a program? Do we see success as making Black, Indigenous, people of color more like white people? Because often that's how we frame success, is like, that is what's ordinary to us. So if we're thinking about a return to being ordinary and successful, that's what we tend to frame it as, and just being really critical of that and challenging it. In some of the work that we've been doing with tribal communities, we found by kind of starting those conversations that we have that different definition of success in a project. So we would come into it focusing very much on individual outcomes like academic success or career success or job placement, kind of as like, okay, the program is working if it's checking these boxes and doing these things. But for them, they would frame it as what is community welfare? What is to the benefit of the entire community? And that would be their definition of success. So starting the conversation very openly and ask a lot of questions and listen, and don't assume that you are on the same page because you're coming from different backgrounds, you're coming from different levels of privilege in, you know, various intersectional areas. And I think also thinking about partnership, kind of trying to understand how trust plays into your work, and how important trust is for relationship building, and that you are not granted trust just because you're present, you know, just because you're coming in and asking questions. And also like asking yourself, am I best positioned to ask these questions? Or could it be someone else who is better positioned? So yeah, again, for one of our rural tribal community projects, we had to conduct interviews with tribal community leaders. And we decided essentially we should not be conducting these interviews because we do not have the trust, we do not have the understanding to frame these interviews properly. So we're going to hire people that are from the community, who have established relationships and who can conduct these. So just being critical and thinking about, is this where I should be, or is there someone else who could better do the work and get that level of trust and understanding?
Great, thank you. Wow, yeah, thank you so much.
And I would just add on to what everyone else is saying, just the aspect of awareness and accountability. So for us, is looking at the fact that we're not going to be able to advance forward if we don't look at where we come from. So in all transparency and honesty, with the American Medical Association, you know, it's over 173 years old, but one of the past presidents was J. Marion Sims, the quote unquote father of gynecology, who also practiced medicine and surgeries on Black female slaves without anesthesia. So it's hard to say, you know, that we're going to move forward and push past and, you know, implement these areas of diversity, inclusion, and equity without actually acknowledging as leadership and within your company or your institution of the past, so that you can really move towards reconciliation and truth and healing. So that's been key for us, and I think key within working through our training. So we've implemented internal trainings too, because there's an inside outside approach, and you know, can't move too far ahead if you don't take care of the house, you know, within. So that's something that we've come to the understanding as a group. And I think it's important for institutions to do that as a whole. And so if you're just one person trying to do that, I think bringing up, you know, this reckoning with the past, but as a conversation of wanting to advance forward together is a particular type of approach, I think, that people could take, you know, within starting these conversations, so that it is not finger pointing, you know, so to speak, but we're just like taking a look back, you know, at history and a look present to see where we say we want to go, and then how do we get there, you know, together, and then understanding that we work collaboratively. So this system of oppression wasn't built by one person. So that moving forward, we have to come together to make this work together. So it's not on one group's shoulders more than another. So partnership and accomplice, you know, ship is really, really important in this.
Thank you. So, you know, you each of you sort of talked about different power dynamics and sort of the challenges of having the challenges and the opportunities, right, of engaging in those uncomfortable conversations, and they're very necessary to have. And sometimes you get the buy-in and the support, and sometimes you don't, right? Sometimes senior leadership remains resistant, and I guess, you know, kind of thinking about that, how do we make sure, and I guess this is, of course, it will vary across organization and institutions and companies, that this is not just an in the moment we're focusing on it because of everything that's happened. But this goes back, this is historical, right? How do we make sure that we continue to engage, continue to advance, continue to question, continue to, to consider positionality, like everything that you've all shared, so that the momentum remains. I'm curious to hear from the three of you as to, how do we just continue to keep doing the hard work and doing it. And Stephanie, I completely, like, I've heard from a couple of different people, who feel that they've been sort of like, because they're the Black person in their organization or group, they've been kind of like, it's all been put on them to answer questions and to lead new task forces and the like. And they're like, it's not their burden to carry, right? It's like, so I'd love to get a few quick thoughts from each of you about that.
Yeah, I would love to start. I think that's very, very crucial. It's just so I know that we're in the momentum now because it's so in our face, and we had, 45 who instilled that in our faces every day. But I think, when we think about sustainability for diversity inclusion, I came with some few action steps that I think help me as a ED, and what I want our organization to look like, and taking the experiences from what I experienced and other corporate that I don't want to include here. So some steps I was mentioning before is we need to continuously monitor and evaluate our diversity and inclusion that we have in organizations. This could be through quarterly reports or an executive key performance indicators to measure diversity. So if we're having monthly reports or quarterly reports with our employees, we should have an indicator in there. How do you feel the workplace environment suits your cultural identity? How do we feel the workplace environment suits your gender identity? So, when we think about diversity and inclusion, it's not just about race, it's about religion, sex, gender, nationality, physical ability. These are the things that we need to have questioned. I think for the last times I've been in corporate environments, these indicators were never in any of my performances. And these are the ones that make a corporation a bit more happier. If your employers are happier and taken care of, obviously your company is going to run just a bit better. So a couple other things: recruit over a broad geographical area, right? So if we, for example, I'm in Los Angeles, we had some interviews last week and person was in Philadelphia. But now that we're all remote, we don't need to be bound by location. We can physically kind of be anywhere and still give our best performances. So I say recruit geographically, recruit in a diverse demographic area. So to have more diversity inclusion, we have to have more diverse employees. And that comes from the top level of management to the lowest level of employment. And so we want to make sure that when diverse employees come in here, our retention rate is higher by making sure that their environment and their workplace suits who they are. A few other things: consider regional diversity training. This should be something that's ongoing. Diversity training is not something, okay, we have it for 6 weeks now we're all diverse, let's get out there and make racism disappear. It doesn't happen that way. I think this is something that's ongoing. We should have, different modules, different steps, different levels of diversity training that we can get to. And maybe we can get to a point where we feel, okay, we have the foundation of diversity and inclusion. Now let's operate it more and include it more in how we treat our employees and how our company policies and missions align with who we have working with ourselves. Consider more flexible work environment. And I think we have that now where we're all remote. Some, very much in minority communities, we have a lot of kids. We have different tasks we need to make sure that are taken care of. We have different responsibilities than someone from an affluent background. So allowing some flexibility to incorporate our work-life balance in a sense. And lastly, as I mentioned, diversity inclusion isn't just about race. It encompasses so many different identities, right? We have intersectionality that encompasses everything. So just ensuring that everything that we have in the company as it stands incorporates our employees and represents our employees.
Fantastic. I've got a quick question for Rosalie and Aziza. And I just want to, it's really important here. I want to be fully transparent that, I talked briefly at the beginning, we're the Center for Global Affairs. And, I think we've really have done a lot of reflection, a lot of thinking about our own work, right? About our own curriculum and where there are some very significant gaps and the racism that is part of global affairs, right? That much of the teaching of international relations is very Eurocentric, right? It's not inclusive always of the global South. And we're having these conversations, but I have to say it's also, our alumni, like the three people here joining me, and current students who are, really sort of pushing us. But I'd be curious to kind of hear from Aziza and Rosalie in terms of where you recognize the gaps in your own graduate studies, both in terms of skill and maybe knowledge gaps, if you don't mind.
You want to go, Rosalie?
Okay, you want to go?
I can go. Sure. I have a lot of thoughts about this that I don't think we have the space and time to share. But I guess one main thing that I wanted to point out with regards to knowledge gap is just an understanding of how the issues that we're taught to see as belonging to elsewhere, to the global South, for example, are also deeply at play here in the US and in global North countries. So I saw this a lot when the Capitol attack happened. On Twitter, people would be like, wow, this is like we're a third world country. This is like we're a banana republic. And I take great issue with that because it shows this like ignorance or lack of understanding of where we are. Like, no, this is America. This is white supremacy at work, and this is where it leads. And Black people of color have been telling us this for years, and we have not been listening. And now we are kind of pushing it off to the side because we're taught to see ourselves as like, we have it figured out. We have no problems here. So I think just an integrating and understanding of that in the curriculum of how some of the issues that we discussed in the classes as being prevalent in other countries are also really deeply at play here. And we have a lot of work to do right here at home. And global affairs, everything we learn applies just as much to where we are now, to our city, to our country, as it does to going off and working in a developing country. And maybe we're better just staying here because we don't, we're not in a position where we can teach other countries how to do it until we have, I think, Stephanie, you were saying that with regards to your organization, like internally, and Aziza, you as well, like we have to have our house in order and we have to have it figured out internally before we can go off and tell others what to do. And yeah, so that's one, I guess, gap that I saw that I think could be addressed in several different ways, just by changing maybe parts of the curriculum or just integrating an understanding of that across all of the classes. And then another point I've been thinking about is just more engagement and interaction with like sort of informal, quote unquote, social change mechanisms like activism, grassroots peace building, just like movement theory that I think could be better integrated outside of the formal structures of the United Nations and, the NGOs that we all know. And because those are the forces that are driving social change. And I think we've seen that really, really clearly this year. And I guess to say one positive thing, because I do have a lot of positive things to say too, but the most valuable class I took at CGA was the mediation class, because it taught me how to do kind of what we were talking about before, which is listening to other people, understanding how to actively listen and be present in a conversation without pushing your own framework and assumptions. And that's something that I've tried to apply to my work and still carry with me. So I'm grateful to have picked that up.
Thank you. Thank you. Aziza, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I would just build on to what Rosalie was saying, just in the space of not seeing myself and others, from the diaspora and the Afro-Caribbean and Africa really represented throughout our curriculum, and understanding that the global issue, or the issues that we're facing in the US with police brutality, is also being faced by Afro-Brazilians in Brazil and living in the favelas. It's also being felt, by those who are living across, in Colombia, like those living in Peru, those living on the continent of Africa, so the experiences regarding systemic oppression is something that is a global issue. And as global leaders, we should be aware of that and understanding how to speak to that and to use our, skill sets to push for positive change. And so in my experience with the CGA, which I, overall really enjoyed, my time there, but I saw that narrative missing in curriculum. I saw that narrative missing in the faculty, makeup, because one of the things, another maybe Southern saying from my background, but if you can see it, you can be it. So not seeing that representation does impact, those students coming through the program. And I think that's one of the gaps, that could be adjusted, and through partnerships, with other institutions and programs, and then making sure that, we build safe spaces. So full transparency for me, I was a part of a group of alums who talked through our experiences, and we realized like something was missing. So we would love to reach out to, the CGA and the faculty about that. So we wrote a letter to express that, and a part of that letter was just mentioning, the fact that we didn't have those spaces all the time for those groups, of students who are, from Indigenous communities, from, Black communities, African countries, countries on the continent of Africa, those within the Afro-Caribbean. And so having those spaces, whether that's through, newsletters, whether that's through, community groups, whether that's through just having a space to vocalize and feel safe as a student of color, as a Black person, as a, Latinx, student, having those different spaces. We didn't always see that. And sometimes within the curriculum, we were kind of expressing those missing connections through our papers and research and things of that nature. So I think bringing that together would help us, really advance, because, within the CGA, it was ingrained, right, that we're the innovators, like we are the change agents, that we know, through our instructors and, through the different assignments that we had in the GFIs, that, we have what it takes to be those global leaders and those agents of change for change. But to have that space during your academic experience is very important too. And I will say one of my favorite classes was building your NGO, building your own NGO, because that provided me with the action steps, right? Like I had gotten the amazing curriculum from other courses and the foundational pieces from other courses, but that helped me just think through, like, how would I actually see this, coming to light. So.
Great. Well, I have it's so funny because I have a whole other 4 questions, are my rapid fire questions that I'm not sure if we're going to get to, because we do have 2 questions from the audience. And I want to make sure that we address them. And the first question, and I'll answer this, and then the second question is for you, Stephanie. And the first question is about why don't we have why is there not a man on the panel? I think it's a great question, and I appreciate it being raised. Partially because these are 3 people I wanted to do an event with, and I asked them, and all 3 of them said yes. And having more than 3, I think, is sometimes too much to have that kind of deep conversation. But it's a point that's well taken. But I'm really just delighted to have these 3 really stellar, outstanding panelists with us today. So thank you. And then the second question is, Stephanie, you mentioned the challenges associated with developing, approving, adapting curriculum in California schools. The Peace Project brings vital information to students who would otherwise not likely learn about it. Have you thought about or had conversations for how to structurally incorporate your mission into more schools in California, New York, and beyond?
Thank you, David, for your question. Yes. Right when I was inducted into the Peace Project, I had to be voted in by the board members. Part of my plan was to go nationally in America. And so to do that, I need a lot more capacity and donations. So we have a nonprofit, and so our salary and overhead expenses are covered by donations and sponsorships. And so the more sponsorship donations I acquire and the more capacity I have with our employees, we do plan to branch out to all the states in America. And so I think this is one of the branches of Los Angeles. We came out here, so now we have New York and LA, but we do, as capacity builds, to go throughout America.
That's great. and this is for all of you, and it's not so much a question, but I think an acknowledgement of how meaningful today's conversation was. Thank you for this amazing discussion. I would like to recommend Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, The Danger of a Single Story, where she highlights the importance of representation and inclusion when building our own stories that ultimately turn into our reality. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. That's wow. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that, Maria. It's very, very powerful. And I have not read that yet, but I definitely will. And any final thoughts before we end today's conversation? And it's an ongoing conversation, but
I would just like to let everybody know that's watching something just from a personal perspective. Something that was shared with me long ago was, if you don't see the path, create the path, and know that, whatever it is, your skill set, your talent, your voice, your story, it matters. And it is a force for change. So even if you feel like I'm in this position, I don't know if I can, make this type of impact, or I'm here, it does not matter. Like, your story and your voice, it matters. And it can impact, change. It's that one small drop in the bucket, that really pushes forth change. So know that whatever that is, like, to use it, to not let anybody tell you that it's not worth anything, because it is. And then to understand the importance of knowledge sharing. So for me, that's working with young people on the outside and showing them like a tool and a skill that I know that can be used to give them a platform for their voices to be heard. So I think that's something I would say is no idea is too small, and no skill set is too limited. So that's my 2 cents.
I love it. I love it. Stephanie, Rosalie, anything that you'd like to add? Because I had one of the questions that I had asked, well, I had a couple of questions about like best or worst leadership career advice. Like, what do you want to share? What do you want to warn people, caution people against? Their billboard for diversity, inclusion, and best book, website, podcast. So take any or all of the above. Anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, definitely. There's something my mom told me I'm going to say. I think she's actually listening in on the conversation now. But she always told me, she goes, if there's an opportunity that sparks you, that sparks your interest, and it creates a huge inspiring light in you, to pay attention to that and follow that, because that's what lights you up, and that's what's going to carry you and pursue you, the things you want to do. And not to think about the how or the why or the when or how am I going to do this. If it sparks you, figure out any way to pursue that idea. And I promise you, it's going to fulfill you. And I feel like we all have our purposes in our life. I feel like my purpose is education. I love education. But whatever sparks you, just to pay attention to that and to follow that, and to make sure that you exhaust every resource within you to make sure that happens.
Oh my gosh, I love that. I'm seriously about to start crying. As a mother of 2 boys, where you're always trying to think like, what are the good messages, and that is so powerful. So, on my behalf, please thank your mom. And that is just, I am about to start crying.
Yes, thank you.
Rosalie?
Yeah, so for the advice question, I was actually thinking about some terrible advice that I've received, and I thought it might be a good message, especially for people who are looking into a career in global affairs, who are maybe going into their first job in global affairs. You're going to hear a lot of you're going to get a lot of pressure to conform to whatever the dominant culture is. So I'm thinking specifically at more established institutions, and specifically for me, my experience with the United Nations, you will face a lot of pressure to conform to that like colonialist, like Northern voice and approach. And you'll hear a lot of, this is how things are. The only way to kind of survive here is to engage in the system and take part in the system. And it will feel very easy to resign to that it will feel very tempting to resign to that. And everything around you will tempt you to do just that and say, okay, I'll go with the dominant culture because that's how I'll get ahead. And it will reward you for going ahead with it too. Like you will get your promotion or you will get, your connections. And I would just ask you not to. And I would ask you to keep pushing back and ask you to find other people who share your perspective because they're around you, they're out there and they're thinking and feeling the same things you do, and then identify ways to push back, which is kind of what Stephanie was describing of doing before, and finding a group of people who share the same issues. There's power in numbers and you can create change even if it might feel tempting or you might feel pressure not to.
Fantastic to sort of flip, to take, kind of bad career advice and to sort of use it to say, no, I'm going to be authentic. I'm not going to conform. And that's going to be part of what moves change forward, right? Being part of the change, not being part of the problem. So, thank you all so much. I am deeply, deeply grateful for the time that you took, for everything that you shared, for the work that you're doing, for really also, I think I've shared with all of you that like you're all impacting me on so many ways, right? In terms of thinking about what we're doing at the CGA, how we can do better. And nothing better than the voices of, of our alumni and students who, are living the program, right? Who are going through it and who can push us and who can help us to do better. And it's, your organizations are so lucky to have the three of you. And thank you for your time. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll be doing another, I have to say, I don't think it's going to beat this one. We're doing another career talk in March. So please do join us. And if you do have any questions about anything that we're doing at the CGA, feel free to reach out to me. Feel free to reach out to anyone at the CGA team. We're here to answer your questions, and hope everyone stays safe and have a nice weekend. And again, please, a round of applause for our fantastic panelists today. Many thanks, Stephanie, Aziza, and Rosalie. Really do appreciate everything that you've shared today.
Thank you for this.